In 1848, a single stretch of iron track was laid across the prairie, and Chicago's destiny changed forever. That year, the Galena and Chicago Union Railroad opened its first line, not to the lead mines of Galena as originally planned, but to a modest settlement called Oak Ridge, today known as Oak Park. Few could have imagined that this short line, running from Canal Street and Kinzie Street, would mark the beginning of Chicago's transformation into the greatest railroad hub in North America. Yet the seeds of controversy, ambition, and struggle were already present. In the early 1800s, Chicago was little more than a trading post at the mouth of the Chicago River. John Kinzie, one of the first settlers, established himself there in 1803. The city's location was strategic. It sat at the crossroads of waterways connecting the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River. Traders and explorers have long recognized its potential. But by the 1830s, Chicago was still a frontier town, muddy streets and wooden shacks defining its landscape. The promise of railroads was revolutionary. Roads were poor, canals limited, and river transport seasonal. Railroads offered speed, reliability, and the ability to connect distant markets. For Chicago, surrounded by fertile farmland and positioned between east and west, the railroad was not just a convenience, it was survival. The Galena and Chicago Union Railroad was chartered in 1836. Its goal was clear: connect Chicago to the lead mines in Galena, Illinois, a booming industry at the time. But financial troubles, political debates, and technical challenges delayed construction. It wasn't until 1848 that the first tracks were laid. The inaugural train was a modest affair. A wood-burning locomotive pulled a few cars across the prairie. Crowds gathered to watch, cheering as the iron horse moved forward. For many, it was a spectacle of modernity. For others, it was a gamble. Railroads were expensive, risky, and untested in the Midwest. Yet the impact was immediate. Farmers in northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin suddenly had a way to move wheat and other crops to Chicago's markets. The city's grain trade exploded. Within a few years, Chicago was no longer just a frontier town, it was a commercial hub. The arrival of railroads was not without conflict. Landowners resisted the laying of tracks across their property. Some feared noise, smoke, and disruption. Others worried about safety. Trains were new, accidents common, and fires sparked by locomotives were a real danger. Financial controversy also surrounded the Galena and Chicago Union. Investors debated whether the railroad should prioritize freight or passenger service. Farmers wanted cheap rates to move crops. Merchants wanted reliable schedules. Politicians argued over subsidies and land grants. Every decision carried tension. Chicago's leaders, however, saw the bigger picture. They believed railroads would secure the city's future, and they were right. By 1850s, multiple lines radiated outward, connecting Chicago to Milwaukee, St. Louis, and eventually the East Coast. The true turning point came when railroads connected Chicago to the wheat fields of northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin. Grain poured into the city, filling warehouses and elevators. Chicago became the nation's leading grain market. This success created new controversies. Railroads controlled rates, and farmers often felt exploited. Accusations of monopoly and unfair pricing began early. Yet the economic boom was undeniable. Chicago's population surged, businesses thrived, and the city's reputation grew. By 1860, Chicago had become the railroad capital of the Midwest. More than a dozen lines converged there, carrying freight and passengers across the region. The city's destiny was sealed. The very first railroad terminal in Chicago stood near Canal Street and Kinzie Street, opening in 1848 with the Galena and Chicago Union Railroad. It was a modest wooden structure, built quickly and cheaply to serve immediate needs. There were no grand waiting halls, no marble floors, and no soaring arches. Instead, passengers boarded trains from simple platforms, and freight was loaded in rough sheds. This terminal reflected the city's frontier character. Chicago was still muddy, crowded, and growing fast. The wooden depot was functional but fragile. Fires, storms, and heavy use wore it down, yet it was enough to launch Chicago into the railroad age. Later stations, like Dearborn, LaSalle, and Union Station, would dwarf it in scale and grandeur, but the humble Kinzie Street Terminal was where it all began. The Galena and Chicago Union Railroad was chartered in 1836 with the ambitious goal of connecting Chicago to the lead mines of Galena, Illinois. At the time, Galena was a booming town, its mines producing vast amounts of lead for bullets, pipes, and paint. Investors believed a railroad would link Chicago's port to Galena's wealth, creating prosperity for both. But by the time tracks extended westward, the lead mines were already in decline. Demand for lead had fallen, and Galena's importance waned. The railroad never reached its intended destination. Instead, it shifted focus to agriculture. Wheat, corn, and livestock became the lifeblood of the line. Farmers in northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin relied on it to move crops to Chicago's markets. This pivot was crucial. Though the Galena line failed in its original mission, its embrace of agricultural trade ensured Chicago's rise as the grain capital of the Midwest. The railroad's unfinished dream became the foundation of the city's prosperity. The locomotives of the 1840s and 1850s were far from reliable. They were noisy, smoky, and prone to breakdowns. Boilers leaked, wheels cracked, and couplings failed. Engineers carried tools and spare parts with them, ready to repair engines on the spot. Passengers often found themselves stranded in the middle of the prairie, waiting hours while crews fixed mechanical failures. Trains could stall in mud, derail on uneven tracks, or lose steam pressure. Travel was unpredictable and delays were common. Yet, for all their flaws, these locomotives represented progress. They moved faster than wagons, carried heavier loads than canal boats, and connected distant towns in ways never before possible. Their imperfections were accepted as part of the price of modernity. Locomotives posed another danger: fire. Sparks from smokestacks often flew into fields, igniting dry grass, crops, and barns. Farmers complained bitterly of losses. Entire harvests could be destroyed by a single passing train. Wooden fences and haystacks were especially vulnerable. Railroads tried to address the problem by adding spark arresters to locomotives, but these devices were imperfect. Fires remained common, fueling resentment among rural communities. Farmers saw railroads as both a blessing and a curse, bringing markets closer but also threatening their livelihoods. This tension between progress and risk defined the early years of Chicago's railroads. The Iron Horse carried prosperity, but it also carried danger. These details remind us that progress was not smooth. Railroads were not miracles of perfection. They were noisy, dirty, and dangerous. Terminals were crude, locomotives broke down, fires destroyed property, and dreams like the Galena connection went unfinished. Yet, despite the messiness, railroads reshaped Chicago forever. They turned a frontier town into a commercial hub. They connected farmers to markets, immigrants to jobs, and merchants to opportunity. The imperfections of early railroads did not stop them from transforming the city's destiny. Chicago's rise was built on these rough beginnings. The wooden depot at Kinzie Street, the broken locomotives, the sparks in the fields, all were part of the story of a city becoming the railroad capital of America. Chicago's geography gave it an advantage that no other city could match. It sat at the meeting point of the Great Lakes and the Mississippi Valley. Railroads could connect eastward to New York and Boston, southward to St. Louis and New Orleans, and westward to the plains and beyond. By 1860, more than a dozen railroads converged in Chicago. The Illinois Central, chartered in 1851, was among the most important. It ran north-south, connecting Chicago to Cairo, Illinois, at the confluence of the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. This line gave Chicago direct access to southern markets and cemented its role as a national hub. Other lines, such as the Chicago and Alton and the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, expanded connections to Missouri, Iowa, and Kansas. Each new line strengthened Chicago's dominance. St. Louis had long been Chicago's rival. Located on the Mississippi River, it was a major trading center. Merchants in St. Louis believed their city would remain the gateway to the West, but railroads shifted the balance. Chicago's leaders, including William B. Ogden and other railroad executives, argued that railroads offered faster, more reliable transport than riverboats. Grain and livestock could move year-round, unaffected by floods or droughts. By the mid-1860s, Chicago had surpassed St. Louis in grain trade. This rivalry was bitter. Newspapers in both cities published attacks. St. Louis accused Chicago of monopolizing trade. Chicago countered that St. Louis was clinging to outdated river transport. The competition shaped regional politics, with each city lobbying for federal support and land grants. As railroads expanded, farmers grew increasingly frustrated. Railroads controlled freight rates, and many believed they were unfair. Farmers accused railroads of charging higher rates for short hauls than for long ones, a practice known as discrimination. The controversy deepened in the 1860s. Farmers organized protests and demanded regulation. In Illinois, the debate became political. Legislators faced pressure to pass laws limiting railroad power. The seeds of the later Granger movement were planted during this decade. For farmers, railroads were both a blessing and a curse. They provided access to markets, but they also wielded immense power. This tension would define Chicago's railroad history for decades. The Civil War, 1861 to 1865, tested Chicago's railroads. The city became a vital supply center for the Union Army. Railroads carried troops, weapons, and food to the front lines. Chicago's stockyards, already growing, supplied meat to soldiers. The Illinois Central played a key role, moving supplies southward. Other lines connected Chicago to eastern cities, ensuring steady communication and transport. The war accelerated railroad expansion as the federal government invested heavily in infrastructure. But the war also brought challenges. Railroads were targets for sabotage. Bridges and tracks were destroyed. Labor shortages plagued construction. Yet Chicago's railroads endured, and by the war's end, the city's position was stronger than ever. One of the most important innovations of the 1860s was the grain elevator. Invented in Buffalo in the 1840s, elevators allowed grain to be stored and moved efficiently. Chicago adopted the technology quickly. By the mid-1860s, massive elevators lined the Chicago River. Railroads brought grain in, elevators stored it, and ships carried it out across the Great Lakes. This system revolutionized trade. Chicago became the nation's grain capital, surpassing all rivals. But controversy followed. Elevator operators, often allied with railroads, controlled prices and storage fees. Farmers accused them of collusion. Once again, progress brought tension. In 1865, Chicago opened its Union Stockyards, a sprawling complex directly tied to railroad expansion. Before this, livestock arrived in scattered pens across the city, creating chaos and inefficiency. The new centralized yards, built on 320 acres south of the city, changed everything. Railroads carried cattle, hogs, and sheep from across the Midwest into Chicago. Once processed, meat was shipped nationwide, reaching cities as far as New York and Boston. The yards became a symbol of Chicago's industrial might. They also revealed the deep connection between railroads and agriculture. Without railroads, the Union stockyards could not have existed. For workers, the yards meant jobs. For farmers, they meant access to markets. For Chicago, they meant prosperity. Yet they also brought controversy. The yards were noisy, dirty, and foul-smelling, and critics worried about pollution and public health. Still, they stood as proof that railroads had reshaped the city's economy. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 destroyed much of the city, but its devastation was foreshadowed by smaller fires throughout the 1860s. Locomotives, with their wood-burning engines, often threw sparks into wooden structures. Grain elevators, depots, and warehouses were especially vulnerable. Farmers and merchants complained of losses. Wooden fences, barns, and sheds burned easily. City leaders worried about safety, but railroads pressed forward, prioritizing expansion over risk. These smaller fires were warnings of what could happen in a city built of wood and powered by steam. When the Great Fire finally came, it revealed the fragility of Chicago's infrastructure. Railroads helped rebuild, carrying in lumber and stone, but the memory of sparks and flames reminded everyone that progress carried danger. Railroads did more than connect cities; they built communities. Along their routes, railroads often established towns, providing housing for workers, depots for freight, and shops for settlers. These towns attracted immigrants and farmers who saw opportunity in proximity to the tracks. Some of these railroad towns still exist today, their origins tied directly to the expansion of Chicago's rail network. They remind us that railroads were not just lines of steel, they were engines of settlement, shaping the geography of the Midwest. For workers, these towns offered stability. For railroads, they ensured loyalty and labor. For settlers, they offered a foothold in a growing region. The towns were small, but their impact was lasting. By the late 1860s, passenger travel through Chicago had grown rapidly. Thousands arrived daily, making the city one of the busiest passenger hubs in the country. Immigrants came seeking work, merchants came to trade, families came to settle. Depots were crowded, trains ran constantly, and the city's streets filled with newcomers. Railroads made Chicago accessible, turning it into a magnet for opportunity. The influx of passengers fueled population growth, economic expansion, and cultural diversity. Yet passenger travel also revealed challenges. Depots were often overwhelmed, schedules unreliable, and accommodations limited. Still, the sheer volume of arrivals showed how railroads had transformed Chicago from a frontier town into a national destination. The expansion of the 1860s had lasting consequences. Chicago's dominance was secured, but at a cost. Farmers distrusted railroads, rivals resented the city's power, and political battles intensified. Yet the benefits were undeniable. Chicago became the nation's leading grain and livestock market. Its population grew from 112,000 in 1860 to nearly 300,000 by 1870. Immigrants arrived in droves, working on railroads, in stockyards, and in factories. The city's identity was reshaped. Chicago was no longer just a place on the map, it was the railroad capital of America. On the evening of October 8, 1871, fire broke out on the city's west side. Fueled by wooden buildings, dry weather, and strong winds, the flames spread rapidly. Within 2 days, much of Chicago lay in ruins. Railroads were both victims and survivors. Terminals, depots, and warehouses burned, tracks twisted in the heat. Grain elevators filled with wheat and corn exploded in flames. Yet railroads also played a role in recovery. They carried supplies, food, and building materials into the city. They transported refugees to safety. The fire revealed both the vulnerability and resilience of Chicago's rail system. It showed how dependent the city had become on railroads and how essential they were to rebuilding. While the fire tested Chicago's strength, farmers across the Midwest were waging a different battle. They accused railroads of unfair practices, charging higher rates for short hauls, favoring certain shippers, and colluding with grain elevator operators. In response, farmers organized the Grange, a national movement founded in 1867. By the early 1870s, the Grange had spread across Illinois, Iowa, and Wisconsin. Farmers demanded regulation of railroads and grain storage. They argued that railroads were monopolies, exploiting rural communities. Illinois became a center of this struggle. In 1871, the state passed laws regulating railroad rates. These Granger laws were controversial. Railroads resisted, claiming the laws violated their rights. Farmers insisted regulation was necessary for survival. The conflict reached the courts. In 1877, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld state regulation in Munn v. Illinois, a landmark case. The decision declared that businesses affecting the public interest could be regulated. For farmers, it was a victory. For railroads, it was a warning. Their power was not absolute. Despite regulation, railroads remained powerful. They controlled routes, rates, and schedules. Merchants and farmers depended on them, but distrust grew. Newspapers published stories of corruption and favoritism. Politicians debated whether railroads had too much influence. Chicago's railroads were at the center of this controversy. The city's grain elevators, often allied with railroads, were accused of manipulating prices. Farmers believed they were trapped, forced to accept whatever rates and fees railroads demanded. This tension created a sense of unease. Railroads had built Chicago's prosperity, but many feared they were exploiting it. The debate over fairness and control became one of the defining themes of the decade. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 reduced much of the city to ashes. The railroads faced immediate crisis. Terminals, depots, and warehouses were destroyed. Tracks were twisted by heat, and grain elevators collapsed in flames. Yet the railroads could not afford to stop. Chicago's survival depended on them. In the weeks after the fire, railroads improvised. They built temporary depots out of tents and wooden sheds, operating in makeshift conditions while permanent structures were rebuilt. Passengers boarded trains under canvas roofs, and freight was loaded in rough shelters. These temporary facilities were fragile, but they kept commerce alive. The sight of trains running through a burned city was both hopeful and haunting. It showed resilience, but also revealed how vulnerable Chicago's infrastructure had been. The railroads became symbols of recovery, carrying in lumber, stone, and steel to rebuild the city. While Chicago rebuilt, farmers across Illinois and the Midwest continued their struggle against railroad power. The Grange movement, founded in 1867, grew rapidly in the 1870s. Farmers organized meetings to protest unfair rates, discriminatory practices, and collusion between railroads and grain elevator operators. Railroads themselves carried farmers to these meetings. Men and women traveled long distances by train to join protests and debates. Ironically, the very system they opposed was the one that enabled their activism. These gatherings were more than protests, they were acts of solidarity. Farmers shared grievances, planned strategies, and demanded regulation. Their voices grew louder, and their movement gained political influence. Chicago, as the railroad capital, became the focal point of their anger and demands. The 1870s were also a decade of experimentation. Railroads began replacing iron rails with stronger steel rails, a change that improved durability and safety. Steel rails could withstand heavier loads and faster trains, reducing accidents and maintenance costs. Chicago's railroads were among the first to adopt these innovations. The city's heavy traffic demanded stronger infrastructure. Grain shipments, livestock trains, and passenger cars all placed immense strain on tracks. Steel offered a solution. Other technologies emerged as well. Improved couplers, better brakes, and stronger locomotives were introduced. These changes reflected the railroad's determination to modernize, even as they faced criticism and controversy. Progress was undeniable, but it was uneven, and accidents still occurred. The iron rails had built Chicago's prosperity, but beneath the surface lay growing unrest. Railroad workers faced long hours, dangerous conditions, and low pay. Farmers still protested unfair rates, and the public increasingly questioned whether railroads had too much power. The decade between 1880 and 1890 was marked by strikes, labor battles, and the fight for fairness. Railroad work was grueling. Track layers labored in harsh weather, often for meager wages. Engineers and firemen faced constant danger from accidents and boiler explosions. Switchmen and brakemen risked their lives daily, coupling cars by hand. Injuries and deaths were common.
By the 1880s, workers began organizing. Labor unions formed, demanding better pay, shorter hours, and safer conditions. The Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, founded earlier in 1863, grew in strength. Other groups, such as the Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen and the Switchmen's Union, emerged. Chicago became a center of labor activism. Its railroads employed thousands, and its workers were determined to fight for dignity. Farmers continued to battle railroads over rates. Workers battled them over wages. Though their struggles were different, they shared a common enemy: railroad corporations that seemed untouchable. This created a sense of solidarity. Farmers supported strikes, seeing them as part of the broader fight against railroad power. Workers sympathized with farmers, understanding that both were exploited. The tension between railroads and the public grew. Railroads had built Chicago's prosperity, but many believed they were abusing it. The 1880s saw several major strikes. One of the most significant was the Great Southwest Railroad Strike of 1886, which spread across multiple states. Though centered in Missouri and Texas, its effects reached Chicago. Workers demanded higher wages and protested unfair practices. In Chicago, strikes disrupted rail traffic. Trains were halted, depots closed, and freight delayed. The city, dependent on railroads, felt the impact immediately. Merchants complained of losses, farmers worried about crops. The public watched anxiously as tensions rose. Railroad companies responded harshly. They hired strikebreakers, called in police, and sought court injunctions. Violence erupted. Workers were beaten, arrested, and sometimes killed. The strikes revealed the deep divide between labor and management. Though not a railroad strike directly, the Haymarket Affair of 1886 reflected the broader labor unrest in Chicago. Workers across industries demanded an 8-hour workday. On May 4th, a rally in Haymarket Square turned violent when a bomb exploded, killing police officers and civilians. The event shocked the nation. Labor activists were blamed, and several were executed after a controversial trial. For railroad workers, the Haymarket Affair was a warning. Organizing carried risks, and the fight for fairness could lead to tragedy. Yet, it also strengthened resolve. Workers believed their struggle was just, and they continued to organize despite repression.
In the 1880s, Eugene V. Debs was still a young man, but he was already emerging as a powerful voice for railroad workers. Born in Indiana in 1855, Debs began his career as a locomotive fireman. He knew firsthand the dangers and hardships of railroad work: long hours, low pay, and constant risk of injury. Debs believed workers deserved dignity and fairness. He helped organize the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen, focusing on mutual aid and solidarity. His speeches inspired workers, urging them to unite against exploitation. In Chicago, where thousands labored in depots, yards, and on tracks, his message resonated deeply. Though his greatest fame would come later with the Pullman Strike of 1894, Debs's early activism in the 1880s laid the foundation. He represented hope for workers who felt powerless against corporations. His rise symbolized the growing strength of labor in Chicago's railroad era. On the other side stood Jay Gould, one of the most powerful railroad magnates of the 19th century. Gould controlled vast networks, including the Union Pacific and other lines. To workers, he symbolized corporate greed. His resistance to strikes and his ruthless business practices fueled anger across the nation. In Chicago, Gould's influence was felt through the railroads that passed through the city. Workers saw him as the embodiment of the corporations that controlled their lives. Farmers and merchants accused magnates like Gould of manipulating rates and exploiting communities. Gould's wealth and power contrasted sharply with the poverty of workers. His name became shorthand for the imbalance between labor and capital. For many in Chicago, he represented the enemy in their struggle for fairness. While national figures like Debs and Gould captured headlines, local union leaders in Chicago played crucial roles in organizing workers and leading protests. They were brakemen, switchmen, engineers, and firemen, ordinary men who risked their jobs to demand justice. These leaders organized strikes, coordinated meetings, and negotiated with railroad companies. They faced intimidation, arrest, and violence, yet they persisted. Their efforts kept the labor movement alive in Chicago, ensuring that workers' voices were heard. Though their names are less remembered, their impact was profound. They built the foundation for larger movements, connecting local struggles to national activism. In the crowded depots and noisy yards of Chicago, they were the ones who stood beside workers, urging them to fight for dignity. Together, these figures highlight the clash between labor and capital. Debs represented the hope of workers seeking fairness. Gould symbolized the power of corporations seeking profit. Local leaders embodied the daily struggle in Chicago's railroads. The 1880s were defined by this conflict. Railroads carried prosperity, but they also carried injustice. Workers organized, corporations resisted, and the city became a battleground for the future of labor. Chicago's railroad story was not just about steel and steam, it was about people. It was about voices demanding fairness and powers resisting change. The clash between labor and capital shaped the city's destiny, leaving a legacy that endured for generations. The demand for an 8-hour workday became the rallying cry of the decade. Railroad workers, like others, labored 10 to 12 hours daily. Accidents were common, fatigue constant. The movement gained momentum in Chicago. Strikes and rallies demanded reform. Though the Haymarket affair cast a shadow, the idea of shorter hours persisted. By the late 1880s, some railroads began experimenting with reduced shifts, though most resisted. The 8-hour day movement symbolized the broader struggle for dignity. It showed that workers were not just fighting for wages, they were fighting for their lives.
George Pullman was a visionary industrialist. His Pullman Palace Car Company, founded in the 1860s, built luxurious railroad cars that transformed passenger travel. By the 1880s, Pullman cars were symbols of comfort and prestige used across the nation. But Pullman's vision extended beyond rail cars. In 1880, he built a company town south of Chicago, known simply as Pullman. Workers lived in neat brick houses, shopped at company stores, and attended company-run schools and churches. Pullman believed he was creating a model community. Yet beneath the surface lay control. Rent was deducted from wages, rules governed behavior. Workers had little independence. Pullman's town was orderly, but it was also restrictive. Many residents felt trapped. In 1893, the United States plunged into a severe economic depression. Businesses closed, banks failed, and unemployment soared. Railroads, heavily indebted, cut wages and laid off workers. Pullman's company was no exception. Wages were slashed, but rents in the company town remained unchanged. Workers struggled to feed their families. Anger grew. They demanded relief, but Pullman refused. He believed lowering rents would undermine his model town. This decision sparked outrage. Workers felt betrayed. The seeds of the strike were planted. In May 1894, Pullman workers walked off the job. They demanded restored wages and reduced rents. The strike quickly spread. The American Railway Union, ARU, led by Eugene V. Debs, supported the workers. Debs, already a rising labor leader, believed the strike symbolized the broader struggle between workers and corporations. The ARU called for a boycott of trains carrying Pullman cars. Across the nation, railroad workers joined. Trains were halted, depots closed, and freight delayed.
Chicago, the nation's railroad hub, was paralyzed. The strike captured national attention. Newspapers reported daily. Public opinion was divided. Some sympathized with workers, others feared chaos. Railroad companies resisted fiercely. They hired strikebreakers, called in police, and sought federal intervention. Violence erupted. In Chicago, clashes between strikers and authorities turned deadly. Rail cars were burned, tracks torn up, and property destroyed. The federal government intervened. President Grover Cleveland sent troops to Chicago. Soldiers patrolled the streets, guarding railroads. Confrontations escalated. By July, dozens were dead, hundreds injured, and thousands arrested. The strike was crushed, but the conflict left scars. Workers felt betrayed by governments siding with corporations. Railroads regained control, but public distrust deepened. The Pullman strike was more than a local conflict. It became a national crisis. Railroads were the arteries of commerce, and their paralysis threatened the economy. The strike forced Americans to confront the balance between labor and capital, between workers' rights and corporate power. The city became the symbol of labor unrest. Its railroads, once celebrated for prosperity, were now associated with conflict and injustice. The strike also reshaped labor activism. Debs emerged as a national leader. The ARU, though weakened, inspired future unions. The idea of collective action gained strength. By 1900, Chicago was the busiest railroad hub in the nation. Trains from every direction converged on the city, carrying grain, livestock, manufactured goods, and passengers. To handle this traffic, new terminals were built. The most famous was Chicago Union Station, planned in the early 1900s and opened later in 1925. Though outside our time frame, its planning reflected the ambitions of the era. Railroads sought grandeur, building depots that symbolized power and modernity. Other stations, such as Dearborn Station and LaSalle Street Station, expanded during this period. They were not just functional, they were civic landmarks, places where travelers experienced the scale of Chicago's rail empire. Technology advanced rapidly. Iron rails, prone to wear, were replaced with steel. Locomotives grew larger and more powerful, capable of hauling heavier loads. Freight cars were standardized, improving efficiency. These changes transformed railroads. Grain moved faster, livestock shipments grew, and passenger travel became more comfortable. Chicago's stockyards thrived, fed by rail connections. Chicago's grain elevators expanded, storing millions of bushels. Yet modernization carried costs. Workers faced new dangers with larger engines. Farmers still complained of unfair rates. Progress did not erase conflict. The memory of the Pullman strike lingered. Workers remained determined to fight for fairness. The early 1900s saw continued strikes and union organizing. The Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, the Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen, and other unions grew in strength. They demanded shorter hours, safer conditions, and better pay. Accidents were common, and workers believed corporations ignored safety in pursuit of profit. Chicago, with its vast rail network, was a center of labor activism. Strikes disrupted traffic, and clashes with police were frequent. The city's prosperity depended on railroads, but unrest revealed its fragility. Farmers continued their battle against railroad rates. The Interstate Commerce Commission, ICC, created in 1887, gained more authority in the early 1900s. It regulated rates, investigated complaints, and sought fairness. For farmers, the ICC was a victory, but railroads resisted. They argued regulation limited growth. The debate continued, with Chicago at the center. Grain elevators, stockyards, and depots all reflected the tension between progress and fairness. The controversy showed that modernization did not solve old problems. Railroads remained powerful, and farmers remained wary. In the early 1920s, Chicago's railroads were at their height. More than 40 railroads operated in the city, carrying millions of tons of freight and millions of passengers each year. Union Station, planned earlier, was completed in 1925, symbolizing the grandeur of the era. Trains connected Chicago to every corner of the nation. Grain, livestock, coal, steel, and manufactured goods flowed through its depots. Passenger trains carried businessmen, immigrants, and tourists. Chicago was the beating heart of America's rail system. Yet, beneath this prosperity, competition was rising. The automobile revolution changed everything. Automobiles gave individuals freedom of movement. Trucks began carrying freight directly from farms and factories to markets. Roads improved, and highways expanded. For railroads, this was a threat. Farmers who once depended on railroads now used trucks. Passengers who once traveled by train now drove cars. Chicago's railroads felt the pressure. Railroads responded with innovation. They introduced faster passenger trains, streamlined locomotives, and improved freight services. Yet the competition was relentless. The iron rails faced rivals on the open road. The 1930s brought disaster. The Great Depression devastated the economy. Businesses closed, unemployment soared, and trade collapsed. Chicago's depots grew quiet. Freight declined, passenger numbers fell, and railroads cut jobs. Workers faced hardship, strikes erupted, and unions demanded relief. The city, once bustling with trains, felt the slowdown. Railroads struggled to survive. Some went bankrupt, others merged. The Depression revealed the vulnerability of an industry once seen as invincible. Yet railroads remained essential. Grain still moved, livestock still shipped, and passengers still traveled. Chicago's railroads endured, though weakened. Labor unrest continued in the 1920s and 1930s. Workers demanded better pay and shorter hours. The memory of the Pullman strike lingered, and unions grew stronger. The Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, the Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen, and other unions organized strikes and protests. The federal government sometimes intervened, seeking compromise. In Chicago, clashes between workers and corporations were frequent. The Depression intensified conflict as railroads cut wages and jobs. Workers fought back, determined to survive. Labor activism became a defining feature of the era. Railroads faced not only economic competition, but also social struggle. In the 1930s, railroads introduced streamlined passenger trains. Sleek, modern, and fast, they symbolized hope in a time of despair. The Burlington Zephyr, introduced in 1934, was among the most famous. It ran from Chicago to Denver, showcasing speed and efficiency. Streamlined trains captured public imagination. They showed that railroads could adapt, innovate, and compete. For Chicago, they were symbols of resilience. Yet they could not erase the broader decline. Automobiles and trucks continued to grow. The Depression continued to weaken railroads. Streamlined trains were a bright light in a dark era.